I love this message a series that we're doing. It's 2 weeks, last week and this week. It's called Simple, the Power of a Prioritized Life. Hey, are any of you like me? Do you ever get overwhelmed by choices? Like there's just too many choices. Like to be honest, I can't even walk down the cereal aisle at the grocery store. I have a panic attack. Like there's just too much to choose from. You know, an area that things have changed in the choice over the last long time is communication. Like I thought about when my wife and I got married. We got married in 1982. I know that's longer than most of you have been breathing, but that's okay. We got married in 1982. I went to college in a different state, and so this is how we communicated in 1982. I could call her on one of those. How many have used one of those? Have you used one of those? How many of you have not had the experience? It took 20 minutes to dial a long distance number. And you hated people that they're 897, like, oh man, I can't dial that. And then that other thing, some of you are not familiar with, it's a letter. And we used to actually hand write those and put them in the mail. And sometime in the next 6 months, they would show up at the place. But those were your choices. You could call or you could write a letter. Now we have a couple more choices. Let's take a look at some of the choices we have. We could email, we could Skype, we could Zoom, we could send a text message, we could send another kind of message, we could Snapchat, whatever that is. We could do all those things. We have so many choices now. I got a text the other day that said, hey, I just sent you an email that is attached to the project that we're working on in the Asana. If you would check that email, look at the project, and then call me. And I'm like, this is not getting better. Like, this is not clearer communication. More choices isn't always better. And that's especially true in what we're talking about in the area of priorities. Because the reality is we can't have 10 priorities. The word priority means what's most important. In fact, a guy named Greg McEwen in a book called Essentialism says this: if you don't prioritize your life, someone else will. And that's absolutely true. So it's very important that we figure out what is important, what our priorities are. And that's what we're talking about. With all the choices that I have in life, with all the things I can choose from, what's the most important? And this is a question that was presented to Jesus. We started talking about this last week. Jesus is toward the end of his ministry, Matthew chapter 22. We're reading about it. Jesus knows that soon he will be going to the cross. And the religious leaders of his day, there's different sects or areas of religious leaders, different kinds of religious leaders, Sadducees and Pharisees, and they all agree on one thing. They want to get rid of Jesus. So they're trying to trick him, they're trying to trap him. They're like giving him a pop quiz in front of the whole school, trying to see if he knows the answers. And the group called the Sadducees have asked him some questions as he answered well. And so we pick up the story in verse 34 of Matthew chapter 22. It says this: hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And as Scotty taught us last week, there are 613 commandments in the Old Testament. And they're saying, okay, of the 613, which one's the most important? Like, should we honor our father and mother, or is it more important to not kill our brother? And if you have an older brother, you know this is a serious dilemma, like to figure out, right? Right? Are you with me? They're saying, which is the most important? They're trying to trick him. And Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. Now, no one in the audience went, I never thought he would come up with that one, because this verse is called the Shema. It's a verse that a devout Jew would say several times a day. They all knew this verse. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. They all knew that. So, what's the most important? To love God. So Scotty taught us last week. He said to love God, we love God with our time. We love God with our trust. Now, this is a foundational message. A lot of times we'll say, hey, you should go back and listen to the message before, and you do or you don't. I feel like I listened to Scotty's message several times last week, and I feel like it's foundational to our lives. It's foundational to what we're going to do next at Journey and what you're going to do throughout 2022. I really recommend, if you weren't here last week, to go back, listen to Scotty's message, and apply it. How do we love God? But Jesus didn't stop there. He didn't just say, love God and then not move on. He went on in the next verse, in verse 34, and said, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Now, it's tricky here. It sounds like Jesus is saying, okay, love God, and then if you get that one done, then love your neighbor. That's not what he's saying at all. He's saying these are two parts of the same priority. Love God, love your neighbor. They're two sides of the same coin. We can't love God, but not love our neighbor. That's like having a car without an engine. Like I could have a Lamborghini in my driveway, and that would be wonderful. And I could sit in it, and all my neighbors would go, look, the old man has a Lamborghini. But if there's no engine in that car, I'm not going anywhere. It's worthless, okay? Loving God and not loving our neighbor is like if you said to me, Geoff, I really love you, and you're cool, and I like being around you, but your wife, she's just, we're done, right? We're done. You love me, you love my wife, okay? You love God, you love your neighbor. It's two parts of the same coin. The power of a prioritized life is based on these two parts of the same whole. So we have to ask the question, love your neighbor. Who is my neighbor? If you're familiar with Luke chapter 10, Jesus goes through the same similar discourse, and they come across these same two verses, love God, love your neighbor. And someone asks Jesus, who is my neighbor? And Jesus responds to that with a story of the Good Samaritan. I'm not going to go through that story today. It's in Luke chapter 10. If you're not familiar with it, I really recommend this week taking some time, read through that. But the bottom line of that story of the Good Samaritan is my neighbor is whoever is in front of me right now. My neighbor is the person who's in front of me right now. My neighbor are those people who live next door to me whose dog will not stop barking. Here's the ironic part. I was writing this message in my office this week at home when the dog next door fired up. And I'm like, I'm supposed to love them? You got to be kidding. My neighbor is the barista at the drive-thru at Starbucks who, when they don't have my drink ready, leans through the window and says, well, what do you have planned today? And I'm thinking to myself, well, my church is doing a 21-day fast, and I'm fasting small talk, so. I didn't say it, but I thought it. My neighbor is the young man at King Soopers. This is his first time to ever bag groceries. I'm excited for him. It only takes him an hour and a half to get my groceries in the bag. And then when I get out to the car, I realize, oh, we're having scrambled eggs for dinner tonight. That's my neighbor. My neighbor is whoever is in front of me right now. In fact, let's practice. Turn to your person sitting next to you and say, howdy, neighbor. Some of you are like, I wish I would have sat someplace else. But that's our neighbor. So that's the simple part. My neighbor is whoever is in front of me right now. How do I love my neighbor? Now, for some of you, this is your jam. Like loving people comes so naturally for you. Like during lockdown, you were kind of messed up for a little while. Then you figured out you could go door to door, knock on people's door, leave them baked goods, and then yell, I love you. You were the ones that were singing happy birthday at every house, even if they didn't have a birthday. Like you drove circles around every nursing home saying, we love you. I mean, it's your jam. It comes natural for you. I know, because I'm married to one of you people, okay? Years ago, my wife and I, we got an opportunity to take a vacation in Portugal. And we were on the seacoast in Portugal. And we always take public transportation when we're on vacations. And we just enjoy just getting out with people. And so we're waiting for a bus. And we're sitting at a bus stop on a bench. And at the other end of the bench, there's a young lady. And we could tell that she was crying softly to herself. And my wife turned to me and said, I wonder why she's crying. And I said, well, I think she's crying because she wants to be left alone. And my wife says, I don't think that's it. Let me check. And so she goes down to the end of the bench. And my wife is amazing, but when we're in other countries, she accidentally adopts the accent of the people in that country, but slowly and very loudly. So in a bad American Portuguese accent, she says in English, do you speak Portuguese? And she says no. And my wife comes back and I said, I think that's a sign from God to leave her alone. And then a lady sits down between us and the lady at the end. And you can tell she's finished with work and she's catching the bus and she's heading home. And my wife turns to her and says, do you speak English? And in very broken English, the lady said back, yes, she speaks a little bit of English. And she says, could you find out with the lady on the end of the bench, why she's crying. And I could see on this lady's face, she was thinking she's crying because she wants to be left alone. And my wife, and very sweetly, insists, and so she goes down and she asks her what's going on, and then she comes back to tell my wife what's going on, but my wife had trouble understanding her accent, and my wife says back to the lady in the middle, "Oh, she's deaf." And I said, "No," she said, "Death, death, someone died." And so we come to find out what had happened. This gets me every time, I'm sorry. What had happened is the lady at the end, the young lady, a year before, her husband had died in one of the apartments in the building behind us. And this was her first time to come back to that apartment, and she was broken. And this lady in the middle that was just trying to get home slides down next to her, puts her arm around her, and they begin to cry together. And then their bus comes, and they both get on the same bus. And as they drove away, we saw them sitting together, connecting and praying, or not praying, but crying and caring for each other. That's amazing. That's what my wife does. She loves people. And a lot of you understand that. It comes naturally for you. And for the rest of us, it's not that we dislike people. It's not that we hate people. It's just not a natural thing for us. And so we need to know, how can I practically love my neighbor? So we're going to look at Jesus in Mark chapter 5 and see how he loves somebody, and that will really help us understand practically how to love our neighbor. So Jesus had a very busy time in ministry in Mark chapter 5. He's healed a bunch of people. Crowds are starting to come. He goes across the Sea of Galilee, and while they're crossing, a huge storm comes up. His disciples think that they're all going to drown. Jesus calms the water. He gets across on the other side thinking he'll get a little rest, but there on the shore is a man who's possessed by demons, and Jesus casts the demons out, and the demons go into pigs, and it's a crazy story. The pigs drown themselves, and they get back in the boat. They come back across the water, and that's where we pick up the story in Mark chapter 5. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. And then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came when he saw Jesus, and he fell at his feet. This is a big deal. We have to pause there. This is a big deal. He's a synagogue leader. In their community, this guy would have been a pretty big deal. It would be maybe like in a small town, the mayor walks into the cafe. Like, everyone knows who this guy is. The other reason we know this guy's a big deal is because the writer, Mark, tells us his name. If you read through the Gospels, you'll notice that we don't find out very many people's names. We know the disciples, we know Jesus, a few other characters. For the most part, it's just the man he healed, the blind man, the woman caught in adultery. But he tells us this guy's name is Jairus, which tells us that Mark knew that his readers would go, "Oh, Jairus, we know who that is." To the disciples, they're thinking, this is a big deal. Like someone from the synagogue recognizes Jesus. He came to see Jesus. Wow, this is like a turning point. Now, not a big deal to Jesus, but a big deal to his disciples. I imagine there's a little bit of a rumble through the crowd. Oh, Jairus is here, and he wants to talk to Jesus. We go on and read that Jairus pleaded earnestly with Jesus. He said, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and lived." So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed and pressed around him. They got to roll. Like, this girl is dying. This is not a good scene. There's a big crowd. They're trying to go as fast as they can. I imagine the disciples are trying to clear a way through. Hey, guys, move out of the way. Jesus is coming through. And they're trying to move forward. And then the story takes a crazy turn. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. This is a shocking part of the story. It's sad that the lady has this disease and she's not been well, but the readers in the first century would have seen something else. She should not have been in that crowd. Because of her disease, the type of disease that it was, she had to stay away from other people, because if she came in contact with someone, they would be ceremonially unclean, which means they could not go to the synagogue. The synagogue was the center of society. They went all the time, and so she had to stay away from people. Not only is she around people, she's around Jesus. If she touches Jesus, he will be considered unclean. Jairus, the temple leader, synagogue leader, will be unclean. They may have to call off church that weekend. Have you ever had that happen? Because this woman shows up in this crowd. What is she thinking? And she knows she shouldn't be there. Like, it's not a surprise. I would imagine that she's wearing a head covering. Her face is probably covering. She's hoping that she can be there, but no one will realize who she is. Take a look at what happens. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd, and she touched his cloak because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she had been freed from her suffering. Wait, she did what? She wasn't just in the crowd. She sought the one guy out that she should not be near, and she touched his clothes. This would be like somebody, they test positive for COVID, so they go to the hospital and find a heart surgeon on his way to surgery and sneeze on him. Like, this is a bad, bad thing. No, but here's the deal. She's put herself and Jesus and everyone around him in bad position, but if she can sneak away, like if she can just sneak out in big crowd, just kind of nonchalantly walk away, no one sees her, no one knows, it's all good. But what happens? At once, Jesus realized the power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" You see, the people are crowding around you, his disciples answered, and yet you can ask, "Who touched me?" The disciples are like, "Oh, we've got things to do. We've got to get to Jairus' house. There's people all around you. What are you talking about?" Somebody touched you, and the woman's over there like, "Yeah, what's he talking about? That's crazy. Yeah, let's get to Jairus' house." But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. He's not going to move until he finds out who it was. He's going to single out this lady. This is the worst possible thing that could have happened to her at that moment. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear. She told him the whole truth. There's no sense in hiding it now. You can almost hear the gasp from the crowd as she's talking. I'm sure they're stepping back going, "Oh my goodness, this is crazy." They're moving away, and now it's just Jesus and this woman in the middle of this crowd. People are just shocked that she's there and what she's done. And how Jesus responds shows us how we love our neighbor. Because Jesus' neighbor at this moment was who? It was the person who was in front of him. It was this lady. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." So how do I love my neighbor? Jesus shows us. The first thing that Jesus did is he paused. He paused. See, Jesus was busy. He had things to do. Like not only did he have to get to Jairus' house, but he had to turn these 12 disciples into a group of teachers that would change the world. He had to pray for people, heal people, teach people. He had to die on a cross and raise again 3 days. He had to change the world in 3 years. There's never been a human with more to do in less time than Jesus, and yet Jesus stopped. He paused. See, this is my biggest challenge. This is my biggest challenge because I am always on my way to somewhere. In my head, with my feet, I'm always moving to what's next. And I'm always moving ahead. And it's hard for me to pause long enough just to see my neighbor. I saw an incredible demonstration of this years ago. Had a chance to go to Chennai, India, a church there called New Life, an incredible church. 30,000 people at that time came to that church. And they did 8 Sunday services back to back with no time in between. And every service, thousands of people packed in every chair, and every aisle was full. The windows were full. Down front, hundreds of people sitting on the floor, all from the lower castes of India, just crowding and coming into this. And I was with the pastor, Pastor Mohan, just this tremendous, wise man of God, leader. And we're walking through the crowd to get to the platform. And a little lady, about this tall, older lady, probably in her 80s, tugs on Pastor Mohan's sleeve. And he stops. Now, they're waiting for him to get to the platform. The next service has to start. We have to get through there, but he stops. He leans down and he listens as she tells her story. And then Pastor Mohan, in that moment, just lays his hand on her shoulder, prays a beautiful prayer. And then we go and start the next service. And I thought, that's what it means to love your neighbor. To be able, no matter what the circumstances, to pause and to see them. So Jesus paused, and then Jesus listened. He listened to this lady. She fell at his feet, it says, and I love this phrase, told him the whole truth. The gospel writer doesn't give us an indication of how long it took to tell the whole truth. I imagine it took a long time. Like, she has a lot to tell. Like, she's already exposed, so she might as well tell the whole story. I would imagine she started with when she was a little girl and talked about growing up and talked about where she grew up. I imagine she talked about when she first had this disease and the doctors that she went to and all the things that they did and how she had no money left and how she was alone in this world. And then she came into this crowd, and I'm sure she told about how she heard about Jesus and got there and touched his coat, and then she felt like she was healed. She told the whole story. And Jesus listened. So many people just need someone to hear their story. They don't need fixed. They don't need advice. They don't need coaching. They don't need connected to the right resource. They just need someone who will stop long enough and listen and hear their story. This has been a huge lesson for me in marriage. Been married for 40 years. My wife and I are madly in love. We've gone through some intense fellowship times. And a lot of them came because I didn't understand this, because I'm Mr. Fix-It. Like, you tell me something, I'll get it fixed. She comes home, she's got a problem at work. You tell her to do this, you tell him to do that. We should have this thing done. Let's go, let's have dinner. It took a counselor to explain to me many times, sometimes your wife just wants to be heard. Sometimes she just needs somebody to hear her story. Sometimes she just needs validation from someone who loves her to hear and understand. Sometimes loving our neighbor is as simple as listening to their story. You see, every human has a deep need to be heard. It's kind of what makes us human. So to love our neighbor, we pause, we stop, we listen. And then the last thing that Jesus did is Jesus added value to his neighbor. He added value to his neighbor. First thing you notice is he calls her daughter. He calls her daughter. Did you know that throughout the New Testament, this is the only person that Jesus ever called daughter? We often tell the story of the woman caught in adultery that Jesus said, I don't condemn you, go and sin no more. He didn't call her daughter. He calls this woman daughter. Why? Because this woman was of the lowest caste of society. As you know, this was a patriarchal society, so women were on the lowest rung. And not only that, because of her disease, she was an outcast. Women would not have anything to do with her. She was alone. And Jesus looked at her and said, you're part of my family. You're one of us. You're my daughter. She added value. He added value by calling her daughter. And then he said, your faith has healed you. He says he's kind of saying to the crowd, this isn't a magic trick. This isn't some mysterious thing. This woman understood something that the wisest healers in the land didn't understand. She understood what it was to have faith that the Son of God would heal her. He says, daughter, your faith has healed you. And then he finally says, go in peace. Be freed from your suffering. You see, because she's encountered Jesus, she goes away a better person. She goes away in a better place. She walks away with peace. Why? Because Jesus loved her. And that's what we're called to. We're called to love God, and we're called to love our neighbor. What does it mean to love our neighbor? It means to leave them better than when we found them. It means that we pause and that we listen, we add value. Let me give you, as we finish, just some practical ways to add value to our neighbor. One way that I can add value is just to be present. To just be present. Somebody put it this way. They said, be where your feet are. Instead of thinking about what I'm going to do next, instead of, just being present and focused and listening. How can I be present? Well, I don't know about you. I have to build it into my calendar. Like, my calendar tends to be this appointment, 10 minutes to drive there, even though it takes 20 minutes, this appointment. By the end of the day, I'm 30 minutes behind. I don't have time to hear what you've got to say. So I have to build margin into my calendar with nothing in there, which makes me itch to see an empty spot. But we're to be present, to encourage, to just be encouraging. Like, how do we add value? By just encouraging people. I met the other day with a friend, and I've known him for a long time. I know his family, and I said, man, how's it going? And he said, family is a mess, talking about his adult parents, and they were divorced years ago, and both have been married multiple times, and so about trying to relate with his dad and trying to relate with his mom, and it's just a mess. Like, this family put the fun in dysfunction. Like, it was rough stuff. But I realized he wasn't asking me to tell him how to be a better son. He wasn't asking for advice how to fix his mom or dad or his family. He just needed encouragement. And I said, dude, that's messed up, man. That is messed up. But let me tell you this. I watch you as a dad with your 2 kids. You're killing it. You're doing an amazing job. You're changing your family's story because you're not treating your kids like your parents have treated you. He walked away encouraged. That's what he needed. He didn't fix, he didn't counsel. He just needed encouraged. So we're present, we encourage, and we follow up. Like, this is a simple thing, but we don't always do it. We just follow up. You wouldn't believe the power of a follow-up text. Like, a few days after I met with my friend, on Saturday, I just texted him and said, hey, man, I was thinking about you, thinking about your family. Hey, you're doing a great job. I'm just praying for you. He texted back and said, man, you don't know how much that means to me. Like, if you're one of the natural love people, you're like, of course you follow up. But if you're one of me, the only way I follow up is I pull out my phone and I put in the calendar, text so-and-so and tell them that you're thinking of them at 9 o'clock on Thursday. And at 9 o'clock on Thursday, when the reminder comes up, I think of them, and then I text them. Imagine what change would come in our community if the thousands of people who call Journey home loved God and loved their neighbors. Like, if we became a people that was known for pausing and talking and focusing on people. If we became a people that said, you know somebody from Journey? I know somebody from Journey. It's the craziest thing. When I tell them a story, like, they're locked and loaded and focused on me. You met somebody from Journey? I met this lady, and she got my phone number, and like a week later, she texted and said she's still thinking about that. So that would be such an impact on Castle Pines and Castle Rock and Parker and Highlands Ranch and Littleton. People from Inglewood would be saying, we got to find out what's going on over there. That's craziness. Where do we do that? How do we do that? Well, one of the places we do it, we practice what we're talking about in small groups. That's why we talk about small groups so much at Journey. Is in a small group, I'm around people that are different than me, and I learn how to listen to their stories, and I learn how to love them and care for them. If you're not in a group, you got to be in a group. Like, you don't get it around here unless you're in one. Next week, we're going to tell you we're going to have great ways to connect and be in a group. For all of us, God has called us to 2 things. He didn't call us to be great at this and this and this. He didn't call us to be successful here and here and here. He didn't say we have to be the best preacher or the best at telling everybody about Jesus, or we don't have to heal people. We don't have to do any of those things. 2 things. Love God. Love your neighbor. It's simple. See, for many of us, we have all these things going on and run through our minds and all these schedules we have to keep, and it's just anxiety is going on. And in the words of the great theologian, Dr. Phil, how's that working out for you? Jesus says 2 sides of the same coin. Love God, love your neighbor, find peace. We're going to pray in just a moment, and then our worship team's going to come, and they're going to sing this song, I Surrender. And as we pray and as we move into that song, what do you need to give up? What do you need to surrender? For some, you need to surrender your life to Christ. You have to say, I've been living my own way, and God, I want to follow you, and we'll give you a chance to do that. For others, you need to surrender your schedule. For others, you need to surrender your desire to always be right. You may need to surrender relationships. You may need to surrender habits. I don't know what it is. But as we're going into 2022, and you want a simple life, a prioritized life, we know what to focus on. What do we need to give up? What do we need to surrender? Will you pray with me? Father, I thank you right now that you have not asked us to do 613 things. You have asked us to do one thing, 2 ways: to love God, to love our neighbor. And Father, that's what we want to do tonight. Lord, I pray for the person who's here today that has not followed you, has not surrendered their life to you. I pray that this morning will be that moment when they just say, Jesus, I give you my life. If that's you, maybe you want to pray a simple prayer like this along with me. Jesus, I'm sorry for my past. I've followed my own path. I've gone my own direction. And Jesus, today I want to surrender that. I want to give it to you. Lord, forgive me of my past. I'll follow you with my future. For others, what is it that Jesus is saying? You've got to surrender your busyness, your schedule, your self-absorption. You've got to lay it down and just focus on loving God and loving others. Father, let us lay it down today before you. And Lord, we ask it